Hello, welcome to today's event, which will explore the role of the private sector in asset recovery. My name's Helena Wood. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, where we track and support the government's work under the Economic Crime Plan. Many of you joining the call today will know as well, but for those who don't, RUSI is a defence and security think tank established in 1831 by the Duke of Wellington, no less. However, the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies is a somewhat more modern function of RUSI, established in 2014 to understand the intersection of illicit finance and security. So I'm delighted to be hosting this discussion today. Asset recovery is a subject I'm known to frequently evangelise on, as are those who are joining me on the session today. And whilst I'm sure there are many joining this session today who will be fellow converts to the cause, for the newcomers to this topic, it's perhaps worth setting out a bit of background as to how we've come to have this discussion today. So we've known for a long time that a kind of lock-em-up approach to tackling criminality has its limitations. For me, to really get behind the problem of criminality, you have to look at the drivers. One of those is actually primarily profit. So to really impact on that criminality, you have to take away the profit through the process of asset recovery. They're motivated by money, so we really have to go against that as a primary driver for why people are undertaking that criminality in the first place. So you take away the money and you take away the motivation. There's also a slightly moral imperative. Crime really shouldn't pay, and I think we can all agree on that. So there in the theory, what happens in practice? What we've seen over the past 30 years is a slew of legislation and policy initiatives aimed at tackling criminal profits and taking away the proceeds of crime. In the UK, this culminated in the UK Proceeds of Crime Act almost 20 years ago, in 2002, which is a veritable Frankenstein's monster of a piece of legislation, which has frequently been tweaked since its inception, including most recently with the addition of the perhaps infamous Unexplained Wealth Order. So far, so theoretically good, only the promises and expectations of that policy imperative really haven't lived up to expectations. Global criminal proceeds are really estimated to come to around $2 trillion per annum, which is an almost inconceivable amount of money. But at best globally, we're really only touching the very low billions in terms of taking away some of that criminal wealth. In the UK specifically, we've really seen a bottoming out, stagnation of the level of criminal proceeds taken out of the system. Annually, we're really only looking at about £200 million being taken out of what is estimated conservatively to be around £15 billion worth of criminal economy. So really, I think we can all agree that's not good enough. And the reasons behind this stagnation are pretty complex, but one part of this is down to the limited resources we've been throwing at the problem, particularly since the inception of austerity since 2010. Which brings us to our conversation today. And it's a buoy we've been going around at CFCS at RUSI for quite some time now, but one which seems all the more pertinent to discuss on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, which inevitably will see a considerable squeeze on public finances over the next few years. So it's a simple question we're exploring today. Do we need to bring in the resources and expertise of the private sector to help us in the attack on criminal wealth? And joining me today are three speakers who are extremely well placed to discuss that question, given they all lead private companies that arguably are doing this already. They're already achieving public policy aims through private action. So to introduce our speakers, we have Catherine Mulhern, CEO of Restitution Impact, a company which provides litigation funding and advice to sovereign governments in taking civil asset recovery action against corrupted state assets. Also joining us, we have Jonathan Benton, CEO of Intelligent Sanctuary, a specialist private financial crime investigation service. And last but not least, we have Aidan Larkin, CEO of Asset Reality, an asset management company specialising in the management of crypto assets and other complex assets for public and private sector clients. So how's the session going to work today? Standard webinar stuff that we're all familiar with after 18 months. But each speaker will speak for around 10 minutes, setting out what their company does, what the drivers for their action are, and what they'd like to see in the future. We'll then go to Q&A. So please do use the Q&A function as we go along to add your questions. And we love a bit of democracy here at RUSI, of course. So please do use the upvote function to vote for the questions you would most like to see me ask respondents at the end of the session. But without further ado, if I could turn to the speakers today, and I'll start with Catherine, if I may. So restitution impact for me has a pretty unique place in the civil litigation funding market, which, to be honest, has been seen as quite a rapacious market in the first place. But your tagline is quite interesting, I think, turning the tools of the city and capitalism against bad actors to clean up the system for greater social good. And here at CFCS RUSI, we often find ourselves bemoaning those actors in the city about their role in facilitating kleptocracy. So it's quite an enticing prospect to hear more about how you can use those tools against the very individuals who are abusing them in the first place. So can you tell us a bit more about restitution impact and what brought you to establish the company? And then, what would you like to see from the future in terms of this as a business model?
Great. Thanks, Helena. I appreciate it. Thanks very much for the introduction. Yeah, in fact, that tagline came from a diplomat. So I was speaking to one of the diplomats of one of the donor governments. I was in Mozambique at the time, and I spoke to him and explained the model to him. And that's actually his tagline. So in the sense, using the tools of capitalism to go after bad actors. I think for us, really restitution is made up of different people from different walks of life, different professional backgrounds, but all of us have had experiences working with what we would call loosely newly democratic, post-conflict, transparency-minded governments in the global South. So for me, I was when I was a younger person focused on development and was doing work as a war crimes investigator. And a lot of the work that we were doing was seeing illicit financial flows come into a certain region, which would essentially weaponize conflict. And so that was really, for me, where the interest in IFFs and where they come from and how potentially you stop them started. I also did quite a bit of work in West Africa, was working for a human rights organization in the Gambia. So lived through the tail end of a dictatorship into a newly democratic government. And as part of that work, then worked with that government and sat side by side with the Minister of Justice and others as we started an investigation process where we found significant amounts of assets. And the Gambia is one of the poorest countries in West Africa, had been effectively stolen over 20 years. There was an architecture of corruption and really been almost industrialized. And the government started to look at ways of bringing it back. But every time they did that, they were really outgunned almost at every stage. So they would have rapacious lawyers come after them. They would often have situations where they would, say, bring a claim. They would then have a countersuit, which was vexatious. So they had to spend money sort of defending in that with respect to that countersuit. And they had corporate sabotage as well. So I would get phone calls from people, and it wasn't just the Gambia. I was working across several governments at the time, and we were seeing similar patterns, which, new government would come in, suitcases of money would be pulled out. In fact, we would get photographs of those suitcases being pulled out. And then the corporate sabotage would start. So somebody would burn down a building trying to get rid of information about what had happened in the past, or somebody would start destroying records, or it would become increasingly aggressive as the government became more active in terms of trying to get money returned. And so for us, that's really where restitution started. And we're made up of development professionals, human rights professionals, lawyers, litigators, investigators, and also those who are quite focused on banking and quantifying sort of claims. And we can talk a little bit about how that works. And what we essentially did is we created something that was very focused and very targeted for these types of governments who were essentially not able to get litigation funding and were essentially being driven out of being able to properly enforce. So, and we've done some work, as have others. Often countries that try to do it themselves, they have maybe 5 to 10% success rate. When you get litigation and funding involved, that success rate goes to about 90%. But the work we really do is now becoming much more urgent, because for us, with the COVID pandemic, and also with the issues around aid and debt as well. So aid is being cut by the global north, and we spent quite a bit of time speaking both to global south governments and also donor governments, and everyone freely admits that. So aid is being cut. The UK is cutting some of their programs 75 to 80%. Debt is becoming scarcer. So people worry about the One Belt, One Road initiative, but really China is starting to cut back and has its own debt problems as well. And so for us, what we're looking at is how do we come up with a bridge that provides support to these governments, essentially going after assets that could potentially be valued in the trillions and get them back so that they can be used by these governments to support their national priorities. And that's essentially what we do. So we work with impact investors and ESG and environmental social governance investors are a very particular breed, but there's a massive amount of financial money in the system, potentially looking for investment. So Goldman Sachs, for example, is now looking at potentially investing, I believe it's, it's like 76, 77 billion in until 2030 in ESG. And if you look at the UK's ODA spend of 11 billion, that gives you a sense of the size. So it's a massive amount of ESG investment that are looking for homes, for places to go. What we've done is essentially work with ESG investors and governments to say assets like claims portfolios relating to corruption are essentially an asset class. So we work with litigation funders and with others in the market to value these claims portfolios, to value these assets. And by doing that, essentially what we've done with these governments is flip these claims portfolios from being a drain on the government to a potential asset for the government. And then we work with investors to value these assets, enforce, and bring the assets back to the governments. But because we work with ESG investors, essentially there's almost a double bottom line for them. So the vast majority of the assets will go back to the government, say 75, 80%, often up to 90% with ESG and impact investors. But as a result of that, because ESG is very particular around transparency and impact, what we do is we work with the governments in line with their national priorities to ensure that the money returned is used in such a way that it does focus on national priorities, but in a way that's transparent and accountable. So essentially what we do is we work to break the cycle of corruption. And the final piece of the puzzle, and something that these governments are very focused on, is we go after advisor enablers as well. So we are agnostic, without fear or favor, which means that for many governments in the global south, having worked with them, and many of my team having worked with them, they say often the global north is a key enabler of a lot of the problems and the issues. So by doing this, essentially, we're also empowering these governments and the global south to put a stop to some of the sort of enabling aspects of the global north, which means that Restitution Impact and others who are doing this are really, in terms of ESG, almost like a pure G governance play. So one of the few in the market that do this. And the final piece of the puzzle for us as well is really working side by side with ESG investors to unlock this, but also donors. So, and donors are looking at the fact that they themselves have issues with their own balance sheet. So what we do, let's take the Canadian government, for example, can put in $1 million in terms of a donation. We can then crowd in, say, 6 million in terms of impact investing and impact funding, which allows us to bring back 100 million of assets, which means that a global North government can put in $1 million with a view to bringing back, say, 90 to 100 million, which can then be spent on things like education, healthcare, and the environment. So it's very powerful, not only for ESG investors and for governments, but also for donors as well.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I think it's a really interesting model, particularly as you point to cuts in aid budgets. Traditionally, we've been trying to fund people to build up their own asset recovery capabilities at source, but we're increasingly finding that hard. And this notion of kind of pump priming a private sector system to allow people to do that is certainly a model that I personally find quite attractive. But can you tell me a bit more about how any barriers you've faced and what you need to see to unlock that in the future? Have you faced any kind of cultural barriers for existence, for example, or any particular legal barriers you think need to be unlocked to really prime such a private sector model for the future?
It's interesting. And you mentioned as well, sort of looking at working with governments to create their own sort of in-house capabilities. So we work symbiotically with governments in the global South. Part of the work that we do is really, it's more of a capacity empowerment work, where we work with global South, for example, independent commissions or prosecutors. And for us, our strategy is really much more aligned with what governments need, which is we can be symbiotic. There are certain things that need to be done in terms of criminal enforcement. We understand that. And our focus is to really do things as quickly as possible with as little political repercussions as we can manage. So that, in a sense, is sort of an answer to your question, which is this particular model has been very focused on these particular types of clients and donors. So I think for others, particularly in the impact in the litigation funding space, would struggle with this sort of approach, because for them, their models are really about maximizing profits, really making sure investors get the most return that they can. And litigation funding is very expensive money. So, but it does create a risk profile for those who use it, which flattens. So you don't have to pay anything if you don't win, but you do have to pay quite a bit to the litigation funder if you do win. So for us, what we really do is flatten that sombrero of profit. So as a result, we've gotten quite a bit of traction, particularly with sort of governments in the global South, but many governments, even donor governments, have said to us, for example, these litigations are becoming too expensive for us because we're also being hit with strike suits. So it's becoming quite an expensive and difficult proposition for us. So I think a part of this is timing. Really, COVID means that everybody's just run out of money.
No, absolutely. And yes, I think you've concentrated your business model on the global South, but I think going forward, I mean, part of the reason for holding this conversation today is the feeling we need to have a sort of grown-up conversation with the public and perhaps admit that the funds aren't there to tackle the level of criminal wealth in the global North. So I certainly hope the example today charges a bit of a discussion, a grown-up discussion, and a realisation that we can't exclude the private sector from the fight. But if I hand over, Jonathan, many of the attendees today will know you from your former role as kind of Britain's top cop tackling international corruption. But now you've moved over to the private sector running Intelligent Sanctuary. I mean, the main question I've got is what does your day job look like in practice? And for me, how does that differ from your old day job? Does it differ very much? So I'd be really keen to hear from you about what the changes you've seen since you've moved to the private sector, and what do you wish you'd known when you were over on the other side?
Right, how do I go on? Thank you, Helena, for that introduction. I was one of many cops that just worked together to investigate grand corruption and financial crime. It was my team, not me, that were the best really at this. So I think just to sort of try and summarize what a quick answer to what you were saying, and then I'll broaden it out, Helena, is there's a couple of key things I think really, and the challenge is access to technology. So access to the right tech and what you can do with it. I still think, and I'll just sort of perhaps compare how Intelligent Sanctuary looks, and that might just be helpful in sort of setting that scene. That and one of the other challenges, perhaps the ability to be flexible. So we've put together financial investigators, former detectives, FBI agents, etc., all who've got like global experience in investigating some of the most complex crimes and understanding really, really complex financial structures and how assets are hidden underneath them. Because frankly, that's essentially what we're talking about here in these sorts of really big grand corruption cases. And with technology, with fusing that with people like military intelligence analysts and forensic accountants and even regulators, and putting them all in one room together, suddenly quite a bit of magic happens. And I think if, in some ways, when we set up the International Corruption Unit at the NCA, I think times are slightly different now. There's more technology available, but and there are even challenges within government in bringing some of this technology into it, because you can't necessarily just integrate a private system into your but I think the structure is really important, and that having that ability to fuse together lots of different skills. And if we just kind of, I know you mentioned earlier the problem, scale of the problem, and whether that fusion of skills, whether we got it right previously, whether we're getting it right now. It is 1 to 2%, whatever that exact figure is, of 2 to 3 million recovered in any business setting, is just not acceptable. It's absolutely not acceptable, and it's growing increasingly unacceptable given how the gap between the rich and the poor, and rich and poor nations around the world. And I think we really do need to think about our law enforcement, as stretched as they are around the world, really need to focus on the most complex and challenging cases. So we probably do need the private sector now to come and pick up some of the slack there. And I think this has been talked about by the Attorney General in the last couple of months, by the Mayor of London, by a number of prominent people, about really what does public-private partnerships look like. And I think even the scale of the challenge that my former colleagues at the NCA and the Met Police and City of London and others are facing, I just did a quick analysis pre-2015, post-2015. Pre-2015, you saw 27 convictions of bribe-related offences, 10 convictions of grand corruption, over 150 million seized. If you look at it post, despite sort of putting 10 million into the investigation of Panama Papers, we've done, I think there's been an awful lot of focus on UWOs. And in fact, my former boss was, I picked up a press statement by him where he said, only a couple of years ago, National Crime Agency officers were looking at hundreds of UWOs, yet we see how that's manifested into results, really, and see what's happened, and we saw, it was fantastic, the first case launched within a year, but then the legal challenges. And in fact, really the first successful case was a serious and organised crime case. Mr. Hussain was so organised that he submitted 127 Libre Arch files in response, at which point his lawyers sat him down and said, we really think you should just accept UWO and walk away, because you've told them exactly how you're committing all your crimes. But that was kind of one of the successes. And then they get hit with all the other fallout of £1.5 million legal fees, and exactly what Catherine's talking about. These are really tight budgets, and it's really difficult for them. So, and I don't want that to be kind of all doom and gloom and about that why then there needs to be the public sector role. And I think it comes back to this, there still is an awful lot of prestige gained, certainly from UK, from US and other developed economies, that are able to hold seriously corrupt actors to account and even put them behind bars. That's really important. That sends such a strong message. But there are other means to go after those 2 to 3 trillion in assets. And if we look at sort of, even the roles at civil, and I'll talk about some of the law in a minute, but we look at the roles of civil power. I kind of have always struggled with this. I don't mind admitting that I was a policeman for nearly 25 years, and I felt, the public charge me to deliver justice, to put people behind bars if they've done something wrong, and that's the appropriate sentence for the crime they've committed. Well, if you're really rich and got really deep pockets, is it right that you can basically buy yourself so you don't go to jail and you just pay your debt back, yet you've committed this really serious crime? But we do have to accept that we're not going to put all these people behind bars. In fact, as we've seen recently, significantly less are going behind bars. So therefore, we've got to think of an alternative way of trying to just try and get the money back to what is often developed and middle income countries from where it's stolen. So how do we, what are we using? What's available out there? I think I spent a lot of time, certainly pre-COVID, traveling around the world, sitting with former contemporaries, heads of anti-corruption agencies and others, sitting down with them, trying to help them. Often the most very basic of technology has denied them to be able to even do the very most basic of checks on the internet. But yet actually, there are some really sophisticated tools, yes, at the end of what we're able to do, so sort of as a commercial outfit, we can access sort of 401 million company records. I was looking at one of our tools this morning, it's like 1.3 billion disclosure documents on there. And a lot of these are original documents, and it's things like the ability to use AI and multilingual search tools that allow you to go into and suddenly find a 7-year-old Russian expat tax record that discloses ownership of a company that, frankly, if you navigating the Cyrillic on an open, this is open data, so it's often might even, might be behind a paywall, but it's essentially something off the surface web that you can access. So it's not that difficult. But you do need some fairly sophisticated tools to do it, and people as well. And I stress a bit the people. And so if we just kind of look more broadly at, how do you bring that technology and how do you use it? And how certainly the skill sets out there's some very, very, very good investigators. And in fact, most of my, they're because of the way policing worked and retirement ages changed, there's an awful lot of very, very experienced people that are still, frankly, got a good 10 to 20 years work still in them if they want to carry on working. So these can be put to good use. They're really, really, really experienced and very capable, and as long as you give them the right tools and the right case management tools, etc. And using that experience now, we're finding, so for those who are familiar with things like the Proceeds of Crime Act, will know the pre-action orders. Essentially, you can get to access sensitive financial information all the way through to action you can take to restrain assets and to ensure they're not dissipated. Well, all of that's paralleled in the civil space. And certainly whilst I'm talking about UK law here, it's not too dissimilar in most jurisdictions. And you can get things like an NPO, Norwich Pharmacal Order. The challenge with all this is the cost. But actually, when you start to, you look at the overall cost of what it costs to investigate a big grand corruption case, and some of those that are fantastic law enforcement have led over the last sort of 10, 15 years, they too were very, very expensive investigations. And if we look at things like Norwich Pharmacal Orders, and then the next thing is there is some really, really good law around the use of sort of looking at unjust enrichment. So you'll see lots of parallels here with essentially the similar that sits in the criminal and the criminal space, be it beyond a reasonable doubt or on the balance of probabilities if it's under sort of Part 5 of the Proceeds of Crime Act. Tort of conversion is fairly straightforward, and I went to law school years ago now. Some of this is very rusty, but I'm not a practicing lawyer, but you look at that tort of conversion, frankly, you've got a Nigerian elite politician who's perhaps was the head of a port agency or something like that. And I happen to be pulling this from Private Eye and work recently done by Finance Uncovered. So it's, and they purchase a house and their ownership of that property gets leaked in a data leak, the Pandora Papers. Well, when you know, that simple comparison of, hang on, this is somebody that for their entire career never earned over £40,000 a year or equivalent, yet now has this asset base worth X. You start to, and you can prove that they've stolen, you know, that they've stolen state funds. There are the tools out there then to go and enforce and recover against that. So, and even things like, you know, monetary judgments in the case of Foskett and McEwen are really, really helpful here, because they help us, you know, say, well, look, there's this pot of money here. Part of it is the proceeds of your wrongdoing. We're going to take that part. So kind of, I just want to sort of finalize on a bit really about, well, how does this all work? And it's all well and good saying the private sector can do this great stuff, but it is expensive. So the criminal investigations, they're expensive. But how do the two kind of work together, and how do you get this this sort of symbiosis, for want of a better term? And I say this because I don't mind admitting, you know, for many years, I kind of saw the private sector as the enemy, or not the enemy, but, you know, the competitor. I saw them as, hang on a minute, I'm charged with doing this job. We're the best place to do it. Leave it to us to get on and do it. But it was really after the Arab Spring that I kind of realized how wrong I was. And a collective effort is really the best effort, because it just gives us a little bit of chance of getting something back. And we did a case called Al Amsaya, which is an old case now, but it really does illustrate that that you can do this. We took a criminal investigation. We had civil lawyers, some who took private action on behalf of, again, apologise, I happen to be Nigeria again on this case, but for keep referring back to Nigeria, but they represented the federal government of Nigeria. We didn't contest the application they made before the High Court to transfer the possession of our investigative material into their possession for use in their civil action. And they managed to very successfully recover assets on behalf of the federal government of Nigeria, leaving us to go and continue. And back to my point right at the beginning of dealing with those really difficult cases. And I think, you know, I would just sort of wrap up there, because I have set a timer and I'm trying to stick to my allotted time. And just say that there is some very, very, you know, really, really, really good technology out there now, and it can be utilized in such a magnificent way, you know, everything from reverse facial imagery to location to working out exactly it, and then fusing that together is really clever, but it's expensive, but I do think I went through the comprehensive spending review round one, you know, for want of a better term, the 2010, when my bosses were looking at me and saying, you've got to cut your resources. Yet we turned all our financial investigators cost neutral. So I managed to make sure my financial investigators at Scotland Yard weren't cut, because they paid for themselves under what's called the Asset Recovery Incentivisation Scheme. We can continue this work, but we're going to have to think dynamically and alternatively. I would suggest I'll stop there at 15 minutes.
Honestly, we could have you speak all day, so we'll do a workshop in the future, but I think there's loads to unpack in there. And one of the themes that comes through for me is that old chestnut of public-private partnership, which seems to be a theme that everyone very much accepts in the anti-money laundering space. But I mean, I welcome your views. Do you think we're slightly behind the curve in the asset recovery world on that concept? The second thing I pick up from what you said is around costs and risk. And that's the part for me that really led us to setting up this conversation today. I think with a comprehensive spending review coming up shortly, imminently in the next few weeks, which is unlikely to be categorised by its generosity, I don't think people are going to put their heads above the parapet on these really high risk cases. So yeah, I'd welcome your thoughts. Public-private partnership, how do we make that work? And what's your views on kind of how we use the private sector to reduce cost risk in this space?
So I think for kind of all the reasons I've outlined, that the private sector can do nearly all of it. It can do it, there can be a symbiosis with what public sector want to do and want to achieve. I'm absolutely convinced of that. There are obstacles around sensitive intelligence, etc., of course, which must stay in, and we have, we've got there's the regulated sector is not going to want their information suddenly being made open to all, and we are going to have to think carefully about how we navigate some of this, and if we can, and even if some of that information can be introduced into the right legal setting once a threshold is met. So you're not just basically handing it over to some investigation company or something like that, you're handing it over to a court in the right setting. Which has then oversight. We do this with private prosecutions. It's proven now. There's a whole number of private prosecutions going through. I think just conscious of of Aidan's time, but the comprehensive spending review, the costs, the litigation costs, etc. Without saying, the private sector would just go after the easy wins. I think we could pick very carefully what cases we go after, and actually the model does work. We can get, and I was talking to a law firm. It would be inappropriate to say who they are, but I was talking to a law firm the other day about another matter, and I remember sitting out in Ukraine and working out how we were going to, and even going there subsequently with the World Bank to help them in their asset recovery efforts. And actually this law firm's now mandated to do all that work, or do a big chunk of that work. So for countries whose money it is that's been stolen, they're happy to engage in this process, I think, which is actually, and even whether it's 75%, 80%, whatever it is, back in the pound, 2%. At the moment, 75% of nothing could be very helpful to some countries.
I think that's a good note to move on, speak to you, Aidan, because a subject we regularly revisit is, well, there's no point doing any of this if you get to the end of an investigation and the assets have been badly managed, and so there's nothing left to recover. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear from you about how you're finding this international landscape and how they're waking up to the benefits of using private asset management companies during the investigation process.
Well, it's something I completely agree with what Jonathan and some of Catherine's points were fascinating in this regard. And I just think that, what are we waiting for? I mean, it couldn't get worse in terms of statistical performance and impact. And that's not a sort of scathing criticism levied at anybody. That's just the reality of the situation. When we look at how we reacted to COVID, the governments didn't try and invent the solution all by themselves. And we have a clear sort of blueprint in front of us with things like crypto asset recovery. I mean, government agencies didn't start by building blockchain sort of analytic tools. I mean, there has been wonderful collaboration in the private sector that has led to incredible results. I mean, it looks like the UK, the US are all on course to eclipse their previous proceeds of crime confiscation and seizure figures in just crypto alone. Like the reality of that and the actual possibilities are clear. And as Jonathan sort of touched on the point, we're fighting with one arm behind our back. What happens when all these incredibly talented prosecutors and investigators and people retire? Where do they go? I mean, they're in the private sector. So there is that. I mean, I was in criminal investigation and revenue and customs, and there is that sort of cliched, sharp intake of breath when someone mentions the private sector collaboration and it's going to cost a lot. But Jonathan summarized it better than I will. I mean, do you want something or nothing? And I would much rather see, as Catherine pointed out, I'd rather a country got 80% back as opposed to, you know, what is the cost of sort of doing nothing. So I think that there's a blueprint and there's opportunities. If we look at this as any business opportunity, you look at what is the problem you're solving and what is the solution and what is your total market that's available. We've already seen problems within the sort of the SAR system where all of this information gets put in. Could that be better analysed by the very talented private sector investigators and prosecutors? Jonathan's point about open source information in Companies House, for example, or that sort of data, the blockchain goes a step further. And we've seen examples of blockchain companies effectively prospecting cases for law enforcement and saying, do you know that guy you looked at 4 years ago? There's $1 billion belonging to him. So those results are there. And if I think of my own sort of UNODC work in a personal capacity, you see these countries being decimated and they just want returns. And there is an appetite locally for action and activity. So I just think that all of the template is there. We're seeing it with crypto asset recovery. So they're very measurable. It's not hypothetical anymore. And we've also seen now the industry react in terms of private prosecutions and some incredible results. So I think they're just, is it maybe looking at, you and I talk about it a lot, the legislative sort of changes that are needed. Not picking on the UK, but I think certain countries haven't made it easy for themselves by not giving themselves the teeth to do things. But there's certainly a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that I don't think we're dealing with. And the last point I'll make, because I would love to argue this back and forward with everybody else as well, is we're saying if we look at like the model in the UK of the ACE teams, the asset confiscation and enforcement teams, and the return on investment you're getting on those cases, where you've got small teams of 4 and 5 financial investigators and a supervisor. I think I've seen the results recently put out by Nick and the team in Ursu, 10 million recovered. I mean, the wages bill isn't 10 million, the resources bill isn't 10 million. So I think there's so many opportunities there that if we continue to go into this with one arm sort of tied behind our back, the results aren't going to change. I think we need to change the narrative around, should we? And it should be just more measurable in terms of if you were to assess this like a private sector company, people would be sacked. People would be held to account. If our COVID statistics we're able to save 1 or 2% of people, or we're able to vaccinate 1 or 2%, I just think that we need to have more data-led decision making, where we look at what works, what system has worked, and then sort of have an approach that actually looks at allocation of old cases, or whether it's a case of letting private sector sort of suggest sort of better solutions to existing problems in terms of how investigations would be approached. But I think it's a positive note. I think all of the proof is there that it's no longer a concept. We're just not seeing it sort of widespread enough.
And if I could pick up on something you said there, there are some barriers to involving the private sector more. Have you got any specific issues you point to? Are they legal, or is it merely that issue of it being difficult to admit that we can't tackle this ourselves as a rich nation?
I think, again, you and I have talked about this in the past. There's already a really clear blueprint in insolvency cases where we appoint experienced people, lots of ex-law enforcement, to use the sets of powers and go after criminals and recover assets. So the system already works all of the time. And again, I use crypto because it's a very technical subject. Again, private sector collaboration wasn't debated, it was a necessity. So I'm almost thinking, what is it do we need to do if the 2% and the 1% statistic doesn't get people excited and doesn't get this being debated more frequently? What is it going to take? And that's why I said at the sort of the beginning, I don't mean to be flippant when I say, what else are we waiting for? What's going to trigger? We're post-pandemic. We have probably decade worth of bounce back loan, COVID-related bailout fraud cases that are going to have to be investigated. We're going to see these massive amounts of money, PPE-related and procurement fraud, all of the asset recovery cases of the future. And I'm concerned that as a sort of tax-paying citizen, if our existing system is not effective, we are now about to emerge from the most complex period in our history to now try and solve a bigger problem in a weakened position. So I think you're right. I think it probably boils down to the barriers, which are just very subjective, because I can't see any data that suggests why we don't do this. The logic for me just isn't there why we're not doing it.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. And you pointed also to we need to start learning from others. Are there any people you would point to, particularly at this moment, that have really grasped the nettle and are using those capabilities of, companies like your own, companies like Jonathan's and Catherine's, better than we are doing it perhaps here in the UK?
Yeah, I think the UK does a very good job, and some of the statistics are very, very good. I do think it comes down to our legislation and our lack of data. We have no data. I mean, if you were to ask, I know that the likes of the JARD system is currently being replaced, but that's not going to solve things. We're not making decisions based on any available data because there is no available data. I mean, ask a chief constable today, how many seized assets have you got in your region? And it's not going to be something that's going to be answered in days, if not weeks. So again, I can't really point to specific examples in terms of private sector collaboration. I think the legislation and data enables better decisions to be made in other countries. So in the Netherlands, they say, well, actually, our legislation should be targeting the asset because the asset depreciates. We're going to enable our investigators and prosecuting judges to make decisions that if the car is not sentimental, we're selling it. That's a really easy bit of low-hanging fruit that if you were able to do that in all of your asset recovery cases, you wouldn't have asset management related storage costs. You wouldn't have depreciation at an incredible rate. But we don't know what the depreciation is in the UK because we don't track it. So I think letting the private sector in, even from a data collection point of view, will then hopefully inform some future decision-making capabilities. Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Lina.
You'd think I would have learned after all this time, wouldn't you, of being online? But yeah, there's certainly a role, I think, for some competitiveness. I was recently looking at the Italians, who have a very good interactive map of which region's doing best on asset recovery. And I think this definitely, I'm definitely behind John. The data will save us, and behind Jonathan's message.
Everyone loves a league table. I mean,
absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, I think we can move to some questions, some interesting questions coming up in the chat, and I'd encourage people to put any more in as we open up to questions. One that's come up, and certainly one that I think will be a policy sticking point for the future for all of our speakers, is around transparency of how do we ensure that the quite inevitable profits that need to be made by your own companies as set out in these stats. How do we make that process as transparent as possible, respecting the fact that you need some commercial sensitivity? And if I could pass back to Catherine on that one, from the litigation funding space, how do you think we should deal with that rub between kind of public policy aims and transparency?
Yeah, well, litigation funders are all open about what their profits are. So, and for us, we would follow what litigation funders do. So they set up as a fund. A lot of them are publicly traded. So, and essentially you can go and have a look at their audited accounts, and it will tell you. So it will tell you how much has been made over what period of time. That there are questions around valuations. So, and that's always a problem when you start looking at claims valuations. But the market has developed so dramatically over the last 10 years that there's transparency around valuations as well. And also claims are starting to be traded. So as a result, for all of us, the transparency is really around the market, and a lot of them are listed. I mean, we would look at something similar. In fact, we have, as part of our model, listing locally. So in the sense, creating something that would be developed and listed within the global south. So creating essentially an asset class that would be listed in, say, in East Africa, which would continue the work and in a really interesting way continue to go after the assets that are starting to filter into the global north. But all of that is built into the models, particularly around funds models and sort of valuations.
So that's really helpful. And if I could pass to you, Jonathan, you made a point which I absolutely subscribe to, which is, if I can distill it, it's, a slice of bread is better than no loaf at all. Do you think it's merely a case that we need to finally admit that it's better not to do this action ourselves, to get those assets, say, from the UK, US, other rich jurisdictions, but to support victim nations in taking their own action through using the services of the private sector? Is this just about a change in conversation to some extent, Jonathan?
I think it's two things. I think it's a combination. So first of all, I don't see any reason whatsoever why we can't continue to use the fantastic resources that we have in the International Corruption Unit, in the FBI, the National International Corruption Unit, in the National Crime Agency, and many others around the world. If you just look at the FBI recently, they've had a fantastic result on 1MDB. They've been I know personally they've been working away solid on that case for since the news broke of it, and it's consumed a lot of resources. But those big, really challenging cases are ideal for really, really sophisticated, smart, highly experienced teams like that team out in Washington. Now, but there's still lots of other slices of bread that need to be, out there that we could put some butter on, and for want of a better term, and so therefore, and actually, when you translate that into countries like some of the poorest countries in the world, I did a lot of work a few years ago in South Sudan with colleagues at the Century, and we looked at the amount of money that was kind of leaking out of that country and going off to support, buying weapons that were being used against their own people. And I couldn't find a single example of any money going back other than donor money going in. So just straightforward aid. I couldn't find any example of their money. And there may well be now, but I don't then. And I tend to keep an eye on these things. I don't think, so countries like that, they're desperately needed. And even if it goes back structured in aid, because it can't go to President Kiir because he'll just use it, to build an extension on his house in Nairobi. But actually it goes back and it's blended into really sophisticated donor programs like we've seen in Nigeria. All that can be done. So it goes back to the people and not back into the pockets of the elites. So I really do think it's time that we did think, and then I think it's another point here also that we can't be all things to all people, and I was very privileged to do my last posting for my last bit of work in the public sector. I was very privileged to sort of lead these big grand corruption investigations. There's a huge amount of diplomacy in there, as one can imagine, and actually there's a part of this that there's a lot of countries want to take charge of the problem themselves and don't necessarily, and there are some very challenging nuances in there, which is actually why they're quite attracted to the private sector, which is why instructing a lawyer acting on their behalf, in their interests, they're the client, and pursuing what they want to be pursued, and as long as it's, in a safe, legal, in an environment where, in courts like US, UK, etc., that gives them control. And I sometimes I find that hard to challenge, and that's, so I think that's another element in here about why actually the private sector does play an important part, because it can give control back to the countries that want to try and take the action to recover their assets.
Yeah, it's a fantastic answer, and I think it's a compelling argument. And one of the questions that's come up in the chat is around, perhaps in the past, maybe a decade, 2 decades ago, asset recovery was absolutely seen as something that was a kind of a public good, a public policy imperative, and something that private sector actors absolutely couldn't have a handle in. There's another example in the chat today about Canada seems to have moved on very much from that model into a much more public-private fusion model. Aidan, I'll come to you if I may. Do you think the conversation has moved on, or do we need to do more to kind of push this public-private fusion model? To an extent, have politicians got over themselves and admitted that we can't, in the global north, deal with the extent to which we've facilitated this problem?
I think the money talks and results talk, and there's just this constant old reference point when we talk about these types of cases where someone's able to rhyme off that one time that a private sector company did something wrong, and that's why we shouldn't do this. But we have officers arrested for corruption. We have people in judiciary arrested and investigated. That's just the cost of doing business is having structures in place that can deal with issues. But again, let's base it on data. Let's run pilots, test something, appoint, I think there was talk at one point of in the UK, the insolvency service, taking those cases. And Jonathan points out, we're not talking about taking the largest national security led cases that have no major tentacles and could be just a disaster if it goes wrong. We're probably talking about the 98% of cases that don't get looked at. I mean, an average crypto fraud victim, less than £100,000 does not get looked at, does not get taken forward for a lack of resources. Again, and that's a global issue. I think in the US, it's nearly 250,000 is the average amount that you'll actually get a sort of a potential for some sort of prosecution. So people are having to go to the private sector to try and find results. And we talk about costs. I don't think there's a private sector company in the world would try and charge 70 or 80% of the realizable value. Base it on stats, set scale rates, audit it. And if it doesn't work, don't appoint them again. So I think that it's great to see some countries are now embracing it, but I think it's being embraced because of necessity post-pandemic. It's not just coming out of the goodness of people's hearts, and there are just individual cheerleaders and evangelists around the world pushing these types of cases forward. But I think some pilots and some data would then start a really interesting debate. If we were able to say, we did it this way, we're getting 1% to 2%. We've tried this way, and actually the returns are so much higher. And I said at the beginning of this conversation, with crypto asset recovery, we've seen that. We've seen public and private sector collaboration, that the results now are exceeding all of the combined results. I mean, the UK is a good example. In the reported cases that I've read about in the press, in the public domain, the Met have had a couple of £100 million worth of crypto seized in the last 6 months. The UK figure for confiscation was 200 million last year. So there just seems to be these incredible opportunities. The IRS went from 700,000 seized to 1.2 billion in 24 months by using public and private sector collaboration. So I think data is going to inform this, but it's probably going to take a bit of a political will and a bit of a push to get some of these cases across the line.
I think that's, absolutely the point, the political will, and drawing on what you said from Catherine's tagline for Restitution Impact, the joy of capitalism is if you create a competitive market, it tends to drive down costs. So, perhaps if I'm looking optimistically at the future, we will have a competitive market in private sector asset recovery for public good. Now we're coming to the end of our time, but if I could give you each a final line, I will be your asset recovery godmother. And if I can give you a final thing, what the one thing, if I could grant you a wish for asset recovery in the next sort of 12 months, what would you like to see as being the change that could really drive this forward? I'll start with Catherine, if I may.
Two things. One is, I think, which is something I talked about at the beginning of this conversation, is really looking at ways to unlock ESG investment in particular. So it's the environmental, social, and governance piece. So there's a massive amount of money that's looking for a home. So by being able to do that, we deal with many of the things that John has raised, which is how do we make sure that these governments are empowered? How do we make sure that there's transparency driven through the system? ESG investment combined with World Bank sort of returns, which they've done over the last several years in Peru and Nigeria, really create almost a throughput or a flow where you can get ESG investment enforcement and then return in a way that's transparent. So, and I think from a timing perspective, we've got to do it now, because what concerns me is that we're actually looking at state fragility going into state collapse. So that the macroeconomic news is not good. So I think we've got to bust a move.
I couldn't agree more. Jonathan, what wish would I grant you were I to have that power?
So it's easy to beat up politicians, but I'd really love to see the government who have spoken quite, have been quite vocal in the role of the private sector in solving a number of problems it faces going forward. I really would like to see it take that seriously now. We've got opportunities with changes. Okay, I know this is an international audience, but we've got changes here in the UK with legislative opportunities coming up. I think a really good focus, a proper scrutiny of what does this look like? How does it work? How are companies selected? How are they scrutinized? How are we making sure that this is a fair and transparent and actually an equitable process that makes business sense. And that scrutiny can only really be driven by government now, who to look at it and to come back and make a decision as to whether this is something that should happen or not.
Absolutely. And Aidan, you have the final word in our session today.
That could be dangerous. I'll wrap it up very quickly. I guess it's just about being objective and being fair. I mean, we see collapses in procurement and public procurement all the time. No one talks about stopping procurement altogether. I don't understand, and I would love someone to explain to me why we're not just running experiments, just try different ways of doing things. And if we try different ways of doing things, we might get a spectacularly good result that starts a new wave of optimism and a different way of doing things. But it's the old-fashioned things of, the definition of insanity is doing the same things over and over again and expecting a different outcome. I'm just hoping that someone will, I think that we talk about these conferences, we're doing this via Zoom, not because we want to, because the pandemic forced us to. This is why so many of these things, we've had to embrace technology, whether we liked it or not, just to get by. I'm actually looking at the silver lining of the financial sort of catastrophes that is awaiting all of the world as we emerge from the sort of pandemic. I think it'll be driven by, we need to find ways to generate revenue. Counter-terrorism officers around the world can't get the software they need because the government can't afford it. And we've seen this firsthand. So, but we've got this pot of money out there in asset recovery. So I think the necessity will drive it.
Absolutely, Mark. And I'd really like to thank a group of people I see as very constructive disruptors who've joined me today and certainly have started charging a global debate about the need to drive forward asset recovery from a socially conscious private sector basis. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you very much to my speakers. And I certainly hope this is the root of a future